What is going on, everybody, and welcome back to another Yu-Gi-Oh! Go Rush episode review. Today, guys, we are going to be discussing episode 13 of Yu-Gi-Oh! Go Rush. Very excited to be discussing this episode with you guys, so without further ado, let's jump right into it. So, generally speaking, what were my thoughts on episode 13 of Yu-Gi-Oh! Go Rush? Well, I thought this was a really solid episode, probably one of the best episodes of the entire show so far, and this was the final episode of the first arc of Yu-Gi-Oh! Go Rush, which, after we kind of go over this episode, I'm going to give my thoughts on the arc as a whole, and then I'm going to quickly talk about my thoughts on the fact that they're doing the 13 episode arcs once again for Yu-Gi-Oh! Go Rush, because I'm going to be honest, I am not really on the positive side with the 13 episode arcs, but we'll discuss that when we get to it. But we got to start off at the beginning of this episode where we're continuing the duel between Yugioh and Yugioh. In the last episode, we saw Yugioh fused with his Voyager Requiem, I believe is what the monster's name. I might just call it Requiem to just make it a lot easier for me. I'm pretty sure I'm pronouncing his archetype wrong, but he ends up fusing with his ace monster, and we get to see basically the new effect that the Earthamar can do, because not only did Yugioh fuse with his monster, but it seems like this Earthamar is affecting everyone's duel disc that's in the Matsuba town, and basically it's making the monsters of people's decks come to life. And this Earthamar ends up being so strong that for the entire episode, Yuhi has actually now passed out to where he will not wake up until the end of this duel. So, yeah, very fascinating there. And I will say, though, that is still one of the biggest things that I want to learn about when it comes to Yuhi and this Earthamar. Like, what is this connection with the Earthamar, and why does this Earthamar keep making him pass out? Because that was not something that was explained in this episode, which I will say, though, if there was some disappointment in the episode, I guess I could say it's probably that, because of the fact that I feel like it would have been nice to kind of learn about that, but maybe this wasn't the time and place for it, so not really much of a complaint. I just feel like that is something that needs to be touched upon as the series does progress, which I do believe they're going to discuss it at some point, because you can't not discuss something in regards to this, because Yuhi continuously passes out from this Earthamar. You can't not just let that go. Like, this is something that is really big when it comes to Yuhi's character, and I feel like you kind of need to explain it at some point. Whether or not they're going to explain it in the next arc or not, we're just going to have to wait and see, but that's something that I feel like they need to focus on when it comes to the Earthamar, besides, what else the Earthamar could actually do, because it seems like this Earthamar can just do a whole bunch of things. So, we're continuing with the duel between Yugioh and Yugioh. We're in the middle of Zweijo's turn after he summoned his Requiem. He was able to deal massive damage to Yugioh. Yugioh goes to his turn, and he's basically trying to figure out a way to deal with this new monster fusion of Zweijo, because apparently Yugioh not only fused with Requiem, but it was also Yuhi that fused with Requiem, and this was something that not only the group mentioned, but Kawaii Tell also mentioned to Asaka, so that's pretty interesting. And I will say this, it was really cool to see Asaka get involved in this episode, which I'll discuss in that in a little bit. So Yugioh has to now try to figure out, okay, I have to deal with Requiem or I'm going to basically die, and I have to figure out a way to be able to get rid of this monster on the field without destroying it and potentially losing Yuhi. So at first it seems like he's going to be able to use a spell card that can bounce Requiem back to the hand, but Yugioh was able to make a stop to this, so there was no way that he can actually bounce Requiem back to his hand, so basically his plan had foiled, so now Yugioh has to now try and survive, and it seems like he does survive. Yugioh tries to further extend his plays, but Yugioh was able to activate a trap to where he can set all those monsters into defense position, so Yugioh basically had to attack through all the monsters, plus dealing a little bit of effect damage as well, which I want to kind of talk about that moment, because they love to bring it up in this episode, because from the way it's being presented, it seems like Yugioh threw the duel, and I will say this, as much as I do like that, because I do think this was the correct decision to do, because the biggest thing with this duel that I wasn't the biggest fan of going into it was that I didn't like the idea that Yugioh was going to lose, and we all knew that Yugioh was going to win. I know some people wanted Yugioh to win, and don't get me wrong, I wanted Yugioh to win, even with this whole thing where Yugioh threw the duel, I would have still preferred him just to straight up win. I feel like when you're a villain, I feel like you should just try to win the duel instead of trying to test your opponent. I don't like when villains do that, but, you know, it's not the end of the world for me, so, yeah. But when it comes down to that, I wanted to see Yugioh win, but because of how the episode was kind of set up, you know, with episode 11, with them trying to train to go and face off against Yugioh, but also this being a 13 episode arc, you know, it made sense for Yugioh to win this duel. So in the best case scenario with what we had, this was the way to go, where you had Yugioh lose, but it was because he threw. Although I will say though, the fact that he threw the duel, or the way they made it seem like he threw the duel, in my opinion, was a little weak. I don't think it was a bad idea to do that. I don't know, just something with it I wasn't the biggest fan of at first. I kind of sat down and thought about it a little bit. I'm a little bit more accepting of it now, but when I first saw it, I didn't really necessarily agree with it, because the fact that the only reason why he seemed like he threw the duel was because he summoned the monster during his turn, and this is where it's more of my perception when it comes to the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Kind of interferes with this whole plot line, because as someone that's been playing the game for years now, I have seen where people will overextend on their boards just to make sure that they can actually win the duel, because you never know what's going to happen. And hell, Yugioh had a set card. You didn't know what was going to happen, although they were hinting that Yugioh knew what the set card was, which I do think that's a little bogus, because how the hell would you know that was a trap card that he's used before? Because we as fans didn't even know that was a trap card he owned, and it was not like you were rush dueling in a Bell Gear, because obviously Rush Duel wasn't a thing. It took until Yugioh came down to Earth to learn about Rush Duel, so how he knew he had that trap, I have no idea, but I don't know, I felt like that was just a weird excuse to say, like, oh yeah, he threw because he knew what the trap card was. But you wanted to see Yugioh resolve, so he basically decided to extend his plays and let Yugioh actually get another turn in. Plus, also, it kind of helped with keeping Yuhi's consciousness alive, which that one was pretty interesting to say the least as well, because he was the villain and he wanted to basically, you know, stop Yugioh from making him not being able to use his Earthamar to take it back up to his home planet to basically solve the war. So that was pretty interesting to say the least, and it definitely makes me a little bit more curious about Yugioh and basically what his character is all about. Is he actually evil? Or, like, what's going on with Yugioh? Because even Yuhi, closer to the end of the episode, mentions that maybe Yugioh isn't such a bad guy after all. Like, so yeah, that's going to be very interesting to learn about. But going back to what I was talking about, you know, the whole idea that the reasons Yugioh threw because of the fact that he basically tried to extend his turn by summoning more monsters, which allowed him to activate his trap, I do think there's an argument with it. I just kind of wish they did it a little different, because to me it just kind of seems like, you know, any typical Yu-Gi-Oh player where they just try to extend their plays a little bit so that way they can kind of guarantee that they're going to be able to win the duel, or they just want to show off. You know, you also have those people that do that as well. Like, I remember when I played Master Duel a couple of weeks ago, I remember there was a player where I was going to lose. Like, I think I had sent, it was a spell card that I couldn't use at all. I just set it to kind of bluff my opponent and basically try and just flex him away instead of just attacking with the monster on his field to be able to just basically win the duel right there, because I couldn't do anything. They just decided to continue extending their play, and they weren't even trying to pop the back row. They just wanted to extend, you know, the flex. So, you know, you also have those players like that as well. But that's, again, this is just me kind of taking the experience that I've had with playing the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! And kind of implementing it with the anime. So that's why I will say, though, my opinion is a little obscure, because of the fact that, you know, my experience with the main game kind of affected with the anime as well. So I do want to kind of reiterate that because maybe that explains some context to where I wish they did a little bit different because of the fact that it just seemed like he just misplayed more than anything. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of bring that up. I don't think it was bad at all. I'm not saying that at all. It's just that, I don't know, I felt like it could have been a little bit stronger, but I do think for what it was, I still thought it was completely fine. And I enjoyed the fact that Zhuai did throw the duel because of the fact that it helps preserve Zhuai character and doesn't hurt him because of this loss. So I do really appreciate that, even though I think they could have been a little stronger on it, but I think it was strong enough for what it was. So not really that big of a deal. But getting back into the duel continues. He was able to deal more damage to Yugioh. Yugioh goes for his final turn, but before he can really do anything, Zhuai actually starts to physically attack him to where this basically didn't become like a rush duel anymore. It became like an actual duel to where they were actually fighting with swords and the like. And even Yugioh got hit pretty hard because he actually got hits from Requiem's physical attack, so he had to deal with that. And in the meantime, you also had the MIK group trying to get to where Mitazuku was to kind of try and stop the Earthamar from helping powering up Zhuai, but Mitazuku was not going to allow that. So apparently she can now split her forms to where she can use like her cherished form or whatever cryptid she is basically part of. I can't remember the name off the top of my head, so I do apologize for that, but she basically was able to use her cryptid form to battle against the MIK guards until Kawaii Tell and Asaka got involved, to where Asaka used this big machinery that she had to basically start destroying the Matsuba Tower and was actually able to steal the Earthamar. We actually see her take the container away from Mitazuku, so basically Mitazuku at that point had to basically retreat and go back to where Zhuai was, and then we start to see, and I think it was prior to her actually stealing the Earthamar, but we started to see that the Earthamar was starting to overpower him a little bit to where he was no longer able to control it. So Yugioh now had to finish this duel because if he didn't do something bad could really happen to Yuhi. And he was still struggling with the duel because he didn't want to attack Requiem because he was afraid that Yuhi was not going to be able to wake up. But thanks to some, I guess, sibling connection that Yuhi and Yumu have to where they can kind of communicate with each other even though Yuhi was knocked out, which I will say I really did like that moment. I think it just shows the connection that they have as siblings between Yuki and Yumu, and I thought that was done magnificently. I love that aspect in the episode. And God, I also got to say this as well, like there is a lot to talk about, but holy crap, Yuki, I am starting to really love Yuki as a character. I think this was his shining moment in the episode. Like, I absolutely loved Yuhi in this episode, and I want to see more of this Yuhi. Like, yeah, we should still have our lovable goofball Yuhi, where even though I don't want any more fart jokes like he had in the last episode, I still want to see more of the typical side of Yuhi that we're going to expect with this character, but see a little bit more moments like this, like we saw Yuhi in this episode. So really love that aspect when it came to Yuhi's character, and basically Yumu gives him some encouraging words that Yuhi wanted to pass on to Yugioh, and Yugioh was able to continue the duel. He's able to summon his Galactic Oblivion thanks to some spell effects, and one of the spell effects allowed it to where Galactic Oblivion can gain enough attack points to not only guarantee to get over Requiem, but also be able to deal enough damage to defeat Zhuai and end the duel. So Zhuai ends up losing this duel, which again, not very surprising. I thought Yugioh made a lot of sense to win this duel, but it was great of how the end of the episode worked. So it seemed like MIK was going to capture Zhuai, but thanks to Mitazuku, they were basically able to flee the scene and basically not get captured by MIK. So after that whole exchange ended up happening, Asaka and Kawaii Tell were also done with their business, so they just probably went back to where, the base is of Asaka, and Yuhi has finally been able to wake up after the duel, and, they exchange a little bit of dialogue. Yugioh notices that Mitazuku is Valgyrian, which I think is very fascinating. So we have 3 Valgyrians on planet Earth right now. We have Yugioh, we have Zhuai, and we have Mitazuku, which, this is really interesting to say the least. And I will say, I'm happy that we have another Valkyrian because, that was one of the biggest things that I felt like this show kind of needed to do because, just having Yugioh and Yugioh as the only Valkyrians, I was hoping that we were going to see more Valkyrians, and it seems like I'm getting that wish. In fact, a lot sooner than I thought we were going to. And it does also make sense from the perspective that Mitazuku seems really close to Yugioh. Like, when you look at Chupataro, I think he was just more of a pawn more than anything. I don't think he was really too involved with Yugioh. He just was an acquaintance of him. And Kawaii Tell, he is just so, like, in the middle that it just didn't really feel like he was a part of Yugioh's team. Yugioh and Mitazuku just feel like, they are the team to deal with. It's just those two, not the four with Kawaii Tell and Chupataro involved. So that's pretty interesting, but being able to learn that was fascinating. You also had the moment where he said that Yugioh might not be as bad of a guy as we thought he was, and then we get to end the episode off where we basically see the new villains of the arc, which was pretty cool to see as well. It seems like we're gonna have 7 new characters as the threats of the next arc, and apparently one of the characters had the same VA as Ronze, which is pretty interesting. And also they mentioned Manabu's name, so it seems like we're gonna be more focused on Manabu's character and potentially MIK as a whole, which I'm very excited about because I wanted to learn more about like these different corporations, UTS and MIK, and the fact that we're going to get an arc that's going to be focused on MIK, and maybe we'll also be having some focus on UTS, but probably primarily more MIK, is super fascinating, and I'm very excited for this next arc. But with that being said, that's pretty much it for the episode itself. Real quickly, just going to give my thoughts overall of the arc as a whole. I thought the arc was solid. I do think this arc dragged on with the tutorials. That's the one thing that really killed this arc for me, was the tutorials. They just were dragged out for so long, and we did not need to spend 11 episodes on tutorials, with 2 of those 11 episodes not actually being tutorials, but the fact that they even lasted that long was stupid enough. It took until the final duel where it felt like we were out of the tutorials, or, the majority of the tutorials. So, that kind of ruined the arc a little bit in my opinion, but I still thought it was a good arc overall. It's not the greatest arc that I've ever seen, but it's the first arc of the show. Obviously, I didn't expect it to be, this fantastic arc, but I just thought overall it was a good arc, to start off Go Rush. But I have to end this video off by talking about the 13 episode arcs for Go Rush, because boy, oh boy, am I not a happy camper when it comes to this decision. So, based off the first arc, it seems like they're going to be doing 13 episode arcs, and I know people are going to make the argument that they're not going to do 13 episode arcs for every arc. They learned their mistake from Sevens, they're not going to do it in this arc. Let's be honest, they are going to follow the 13 episode arcs all the way through. Not only are they going to try to do 8 arcs in a 2-year span, and it fits with the 13 episode arcs, but they did it in 7s and they're comfortable with it. So it makes sense for them to do 13 episode arcs again for the show. And I'm just going to be honest, it's not a good idea to do that for 2 reasons. A, I think 13 episodes is not enough for the storylines that they've tried to tell with 7 specifically. Now, maybe Go Rush can change my opinion on that, and maybe the 13 episode arcs can work for this show, but I don't know. I just feel like you're not giving yourself enough leg room by limiting yourself to only 13 episode arcs. And yeah, we've had arcs before, like Crashtown, that was not that long, but not only did it not focus on a lot of characters, it was a mini arc. It was meant to be a shorter arc. These are meant to be main arcs of the show, and because they're trying to cram so many characters into one storyline, I just feel like characters do not get enough development, or storylines do not get fleshed out enough, because you're trying to have these bigger arcs than something like Crashtown, and you're not able to basically get enough room to work with because you only have 13 episodes to do it. And the second reason is that it's too formulaic. You shouldn't make every single arc the same length, because it makes arcs so predictable, because you basically know, how the arc is going to play out because you know how many episodes they're going to work with. It just makes it way too predictable, and it just doesn't make it as enjoyable than it could be. Now, the best case scenario that they could do is they flex the amount of episode arcs that they do. Like maybe one arc is like 20 episodes, then the next arc is like a mini arc where it's just 8 episodes and maybe it focuses more on Yugioh and Yugioh or Yuki and Yuumu, and then focuses on this threat that those 2 or 3 characters, how many you want, not a whole lot, I would think 2 to 3 is enough, but basically they have to deal with this mini threat, and then maybe you go back to a more important arc. Like, if you do something like that, I think that's can work very well. I don't think they should try to push to 8 arcs. Yes, I know they're trying to be thematical with it, but I don't know, I just feel like it just seems like it might not work in the long run. I don't know. I just feel like they shouldn't be trying to push for these formulaic 13 episode patterns. I just don't think it's good for the show, and I think they need to try to find a way to avoid doing that. The first arc, I'm completely fine with it because it's more based off of getting us introduced into the show, getting us through the tutorials. It's not the biggest deal in the world if the first arc is 13 episode arcs. So that's completely fine. But I feel like as we further go down the show and we get more characters involved in the show and you're trying to grow more of these characters, like, I don't know, I feel like you just cannot do it with 13 episodes to work with. And I feel like they just need to change that pattern. They might change it. I'm not saying it's not possible, but because it's just so perfect to be able to do 13 episode arcs in 8 arcs, like, I don't know, it just seems so obvious that they're going to do it. But, let me know your guys' thoughts on it, because I would like to hear whether you guys think they are going to do it or not. But with that being said, that is going to be it for this Go Rush episode review. Hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know your guys' thoughts on episode 13 of Yugioh Go Rush. Did you guys like the episode? Did you think the episode was okay? Or are you not the biggest fan of this episode? Let me know your guys' thoughts on the duel between Yugioh and Yugioh. Let me know your guys' thoughts on the arc as a whole. And let me know your guys' thoughts on the 13 episode arcs returning for Go Rush. And do you guys think they're going to do a formulaic 13 episode arcs like they did in Sevens? Or do you think they're going to be a little bit more, flexible when it comes to these arcs, where they're going to do different episode lengths every time? Like, I would love to hear your guys' thoughts on all of episode 13 and for the rest of the show and how the arcs are going to work down below. But with that being said, that's going to be it. Thank you guys so much for watching, and until next time, guys, take care and have yourselves a great rest of your day.